Hi everyone, it's Mr. Sinti, and today's conversation is going to be the beginning of our discussion of pregnancy. And of course, pregnancy is such a wonderful opportunity for a woman to be able to procreate, to have new children, such an exciting adventure. And so all of this begins, as you can see here, little embryo that's developing in the amniotic sac right here. Here's the umbilical cord connected to the placenta. Well, pregnancy is such a wonderful process. It takes about 40 weeks in a human. That's the gestation period. And what's interesting is there's different stages. So we want to begin this conversation by talking about the first part of this, which is becoming pregnant, which is conception, or we like to talk about fertilization. In other words, the union of the sperm and the egg. But then we're going to want to discuss the development of the embryo and then how that transitioned to a fetus and all those events that occur in the development of a baby, a newborn baby when it comes out. So it's such a wonderful process. Let's jump right into it. And so I was mentioning this conversation is going to be mainly about fertilization. But ultimately, pregnancy is about an offspring that develops inside a woman's uterus or womb. And it's the result of fertilization. And so jumping right into this. So before we get into the details of fertilization, you might say, well, how long is pregnancy? I mentioned it's 40 weeks, but that's an average, and that's what we mean by full term. Sometimes babies go after the due date, sometimes they're a little bit before the due date. So it's a little bit of an average. And so what's weird about this is that all of you know that ovulation, which is the release of the egg from the ovary, occurs approximately midway through your 4-week cycle. So that would be around day 14. And so what's interesting about that is, that's when you become pregnant. And so you might be thinking, all right, if the baby's conceived, then it's, 40 weeks from there? No, actually the doctors measure this a little bit differently, and so I want to get into that because though it's cumbersome, there's no changing it, and you cannot resist it. This is what the doctor is going to tell you when she determines your due date. So the doctors are going to count 40 weeks, which is about 9.5 months. You might have heard of that, 9-month pregnancy. So about 9.5 months, but they start counting on the first day of your last period. The first day of your last period. Okay, so that means that you had a period, and then about 14 days into your cycle, say you became pregnant. And so technically you don't become pregnant until around the 2nd week of your cycle. But the doctor will tell you you're 4 weeks pregnant when you go in for a checkup because you've missed your period, and then they'll say, well, let's start counting from the first day of your last period. So that's where the 4 weeks already comes into it. So this may not become an important issue until you're actually pregnant, and then doctors have, and there's websites as well, but they have this little card thing where they can sort of slide back and forth and tell you the due date. It's exciting. So the thing is, in order for conception to take place, the sperm have to get to the egg and the egg has to get to the sperm. They have to meet each other. And so, as you know, the eggs are created in the ovary, and when the follicle matures, and there's ovulation, it gets picked up by the fimbriae, and then it moves down the fallopian tube with the cilia, propelling it with the mucus. So the egg moves a little bit down the fallopian tube, but the sperm have to enter into the vagina, and they have to pass through the cervix, and they have to go through the uterus. And so they have to travel all this way up the fallopian tube in order for fertilization to take place. So fertilization occurs in the sort of upper half of the fallopian tube. And what's interesting is it would be very difficult to get through the uterus if the endometrium was really thick. So as you may know from our previous discussions, the endometrium is not as thick on day 14. Also, the cervix secretes a lot of mucus, and so under the influence of estrogen that's being produced by the follicle, that high amount of estrogen causes the cervix to not produce as much mucus, so therefore the sperm is able to travel easily through the opening of the cervix, through the uterus all the way up into the fallopian tube where fertilization takes place. And so the idea is to get the sperm into the fallopian tube around this time, because notice the uterus endometrium is not as thick at that time, and you notice here the high levels of estrogen cause the mucus to be reduced. And so fertilization is about the egg penetrating into the sperm. And so what's fascinating about this is that they have to bore through all of these outer cells that surround the egg. Do you see them here, known as the corona radiata? So as they're boring through these cells, what happens is they erode this acrosomal enzyme cap that's on the tip of the sperm, which then frees up the enzymes that are necessary to penetrate the egg membrane. The egg membrane has a special name called zona pellucida. And what's fascinating about that is you only want one egg to fertilize one sperm to fertilize the egg, because biologically, I think you know this, that if this is a haploid sperm and a haploid egg, then together they make a diploid. So if there's, for a human, 23 and 23 make 46. If multiple sperm were to allow their DNA to enter into the egg, it wouldn't appreciate that. So this is a real cool picture. This is a scanning electron microscope photograph of conception. Here's the sperm meeting the egg for the first time. So this is how we all began our lives. So our father and our mother. So inside that pink area is all the DNA from our father, and inside the egg. Notice how much larger the egg is. And then this is the flagella, which helps the sperm to swim along. So all of this is happening in the fallopian tube. So there's usually more than one sperm. I know that there's hundreds of million that are ejaculated into the female body, but there's only a few hundred approximately that make it to this point. Remember, the female body is not as friendly to the sperm, but one will make it. This little guy over here is a polar body. Here's the ova right there. And so here's a cool picture showing the membrane, special membrane, that when a sperm fertilizes it, it becomes impenetrable. So the zona pellucida. So it doesn't allow any additional sperm to be able to penetrate it. Kind of cool. Another really impressive photograph of the sperm actually entering. So it's the head of the sperm that enters, and the flagella is usually left on the outside. So here's a picture from a textbook showing the sperm penetrating through the corona radiata, which are these outer cells that surround. Here's the polar body. And then what's interesting is a little bit of a biological detail, but I find it curious, that after fertilization, meiosis II occurs. And so that's what's happening here. You're like, what's going on? The cell looks like it's undergoing some sort of mitotic event. You might remember that meiosis II is mitosis. So that's what happens. It creates yet another haploid cell in a polar body. And so here's a detail of the sperm penetrating, and then it's able to fertilize the egg down below. Occasionally I like to bring this up in my classes. I found this website that has really cool stained glass artwork, and this is incredible. You might recognize it, but this is the ova, and here's the nucleus, here's the zona pellucida, and here's the corona radiata. Pretty weird to have this like in your house, but you know. Here's a picture of the egg, and here's the sperm trying to find it. Where are we? We're in the fallopian tube at this point. This is another picture, beautiful picture, light microscope of the egg. Here's the corona radiata that surrounds. Here's all the sperm. You can see their tail, and they're all trying to get in. It's sort of a little bit of a competitive race to see which one gets in there first. And so before I get into this cleavage period, I want to show you like a little something from the web that I find interesting over here. So this is a picture of inside the vagina. So this is where the penis is going to be present during sexual intercourse. And when the semen is ejaculated, it all happens like right here. It's all shot into the cervix. So all that semen is going past the cervix into the uterus. So that's what's happening. And here's a picture showing that. So this is kind of an awkward kind of picture, but it's actually showing sexual intercourse. It's showing the penis entering into the birth canal. So that previous picture was right in this area. So do you see the cervix here? And here's the end of the birth canal. So the semen's coming in here. This is actually a video, so I can let this play. So here's the penis, the vagina, here's the uterus. So the semen is coming down the urethra, and in the process of ejaculation, it's going to be deposited right here at the mouth of the cervix. And then again, if it's around day 14, the mucous membrane is not very thick, and so now the sperm are traveling. About 50% of them go one way, 50% go the other way. What's fascinating about sperm, another biological point, is that some of the sperm contain a head, a middle, and a tail. The middle is where the mitochondria is, but what's interesting is here's the acrosomal cap, where the enzymes are necessary to break down the corona radiata. But the DNA comes from the father, and what's fascinating is that, you may remember this from biology, is that half the sperm have a Y chromosome in them, and the other half of the sperm have an X chromosome. So if the Y fertilizes the egg, you're going to have a boy, and if the X sperm fertilizes the egg, you're going to have a girl. So the male determines the gender of the offspring, or the sex, as well as all these other characteristics, height and body shape and eye color and all of these things that are genetically determined. But here's the ovary, and here's the egg coming down, sort of like a bowling ball coming down the alley here. And so how is the egg able to do this? Well, the lining, the cell tissue that lines the fallopian tube, moves it along. Now, the egg has to be fertilized in about a day or so, or else it'll die. And so here are the sperm battling and battling, trying to get through the corona radiata. And so they're boring through using their acrosomal caps, and they're trying to penetrate it. And hopefully they'll be able to do that. But the thing is, once the egg is fertilized, then you don't want any more sperm that will get through. And so once one gets through, and it looks like this one's going to make it, a membrane is going to shoot up, and it's going to make it impenetrable. Now, this particular video goes a little bit, takes liberties, and it puts this sort of barrier way far out here, but in fact, I believe the barrier is actually right here in the zone of pellucida, but that's okay. So the sperm introduces the male genetic material and the female over here, and then when the sperm nucleus and the ova nucleus unite, it forms the zygote, and that's going to be eventually grow into the embryo, fetus, and baby. So that's how you get fertilization to take place, and there's your zygote. Now, what's fascinating here, many things, let me come back over here too, is that one of the first things that's going to happen, but it takes about a little bit more than a day, is that when the zygote is fertilized, obviously we're not just one giant large cell, we're made up of trillions of cells. And so when the zygote is moving down towards the fallopian tube, down towards the uterus, the cells begin to divide through mitosis. So these two cells are identical to one another. And then cytokinesis is when the two cells pinch in, or cell division. And you can see here the cleavage furrow is formed. So there's a lot of mitosis as the cells move down. And so that week or two, as these cells are moving down to the uterus, is actually called the cleavage period, meaning that it's a time of active mitosis and cell division. So here it is, the two-cell stage. Notice how the cells are a little bit smaller right there as they move down. I really like this picture. It shows that fertilization is taking place here in the fallopian tube. Remember, the egg is only going to last approximately a day if the sperm isn't present. And then the first cleavage occurs. So you go from the zygote to two cells. And so that takes about a 24-hour period of time. And then, this makes sense. You go from 2 cells to 4 cells to 8 cells. And so this is what we mean by the cleavage period. Meanwhile, it's moving down, down, down towards the uterus. Notice the endometrium. So how long does it take before it actually implants itself into the endometrium? So approximately a week. That's what it's going to take before these cells implant into the uterus. So we have names for these because this whole study that we're considering right here, this cleavage period in embryology, is a branch of biology, and so we like to give names to these things. And so scientists first observed this, and it reminded people of a little bit of a mulberry, and so they referred to this early grouping of cells as a morula. And so here's the 4-cell stage right here, so it's 2 cells, 4 cells. There's an actual picture. That was a computer animation if you didn't recognize it. This is the actual 4-cell stage, still in the fallopian tube. And then you get into this morula, and this is a beautiful picture. Look at these cells right here. So it's like a little berry, like a little raspberry, a little blackberry in the morula early. And as it's moving down towards the uterus, you can see here, then there's even more cells. So this is the true morula, or the late morula, as it's referred to as. And so this is moving down. This is that picture is right about here. So we're almost going to implant into the wall of the uterus. But I also want to take a little bit of a sidestep on this. So picture the morula coming down the fallopian tube. Check this out. Something could happen along that journey, that 1 week, and that is you can get identical twins, because as the morula is moving down the fallopian tube, what can happen is some of those cells can actually physically fracture. And this is a picture showing the sperm, and this is sort of a recap of what we're talking about. So here's fertilization. There's the sperm uniting with the egg to produce the zygote. Then there's the 2-cell stage, the 4, and then many cells. This is the early morula. And then, oh, look at that. Let me just pause it. So as the morula was moving down, the morula fractured into 2 separate entities. Now these cells are genetically the same. So this has the potential of implanting into the uterus, and so does this. This is how you get identical twins. They have the exact same DNA. So if this is a girl, this is a girl. If this is a boy, this is a boy. So identical twins, and we don't really know exactly why this happens. It happens sometimes, fairly rarely, that the morula will break up into 2 distinctive structures. Now, if those are identical twins, how do you get fraternal twins? Fraternal twins is a little bit easier to explain, and if I come over here, I can show you that. Like fraternal twins would be when ovulation occurs. You may not even realize this, but you could ovulate 2 eggs 1 month. How do you like that? And of course there's multiple sperm, and they're willing to fertilize. So you can get 2 eggs to be fertilized, and they can be a boy, or a girl, or a boy. But those are basically just siblings. So twins, they'll be going down, and they both will implant in the uterus. And there's some commonality because they're growing up in the same uterus, and they're subject to the same level of hormone of the mother. They're subject to the same nutrition that the mother is consuming during pregnancy. But they're really no more than brother and sister, or brothers that are born at the exact same time. So they're sort of like, instead of roommates, they're like womb mates, so to speak. And so let's get back over here. And so let me just direct your attention. So the morula, a major event occurs right here. So what happens in the morula is that the grouping of cells, which is sort of a ball of cells, becomes a hollow ball. So it's like a tennis ball. And what's interesting is there's cells that make the outside, and then there's a group of cells that find their way to the inside. You see these blue cells? These are called stem cells, and these are going to become the embryo in your future baby. Those cells are called stem cells because they're pluripotent, meaning that they're undifferentiated. They could be muscle tissue, they could be nerve tissue, they could be epithelial tissue, they can be anything at this point. They haven't differentiated or specialized yet. And so this structure with the cells on the inside and hollow ball of fluid is called the blastocyst. So the blastocyst, beautiful picture of it. This is going to be the embryo right here inside. This is what implants into the inner endometrium of the uterus, the blastocyst. So this is a picture scanning micrograph of the blastocyst. These outer cells are really important during that first week. because what's happening during that first week is they have to produce a hormone. Those outer cells have to produce a hormone that communicates to the ovary that there is a baby. Because if the corpus luteum breaks down, that means that estrogen and progesterone will drop off, and that means the endometrium will die off and be shed during menstruation, and you don't want that if you're pregnant. So one of the very first things that the embryo must do is send a signal to the ovary saying, I'm here, I'm here, I'm here, don't stay put, corpus luteum, do not disintegrate, corpus luteum. So these outer cells of the blastocyst are called trophoblast cells. I know a lot of vocabulary, but that's the way it is. These trophoblast cells produce the hormone HCG, which is the pregnancy hormone. It stands for human chorionic gonadotropin. So HCG travels from the uterus, there's a lot of capillaries there in the endometrium, travels right to the ovary, and it says maintain the uterine lining so you don't lose the embryo during pregnancy. And so as you can see here, early on in the very first month there's a high concentration of HCG hormone. But then it drops off. It's not really necessary. And you're like, well, you just said that it was necessary so that you don't have a period. Yes, I did say that. But the corpus luteum is critical to maintain the uterine lining. But as it turns out, during pregnancy, as the months go on, your new organ that you're going to form in the uterus called the placenta produces a large amount of estrogen and progesterone, which helps to maintain the uterine lining during pregnancy. So HCG can be detected, and if that's detected in your body through either a blood test or urine, that's how we know that you're pregnant. And so an ELISA test, an enzyme-linked immunosorbent assay, can test for the presence of HCG. And then once the blastocyst becomes implanted, really for the next 8 weeks or 2 months, we consider that to be embryonic development, or you have an embryo. And then all the way from there to the end of pregnancy, the other 38 weeks, you're considered to have a fetus. So there's embryonic development and then fetal development. And so the cells, some of the cells of the blastocyst will become the placenta, which will then secrete those estrogen and progesterone. And then here's the embryo connected with the umbilical cord to the placenta. Those are not, estrogen and progesterone are not the only hormones that the placenta makes. It also makes placental lactogen. And you might, by the name, know that this is affecting milk. And so this hormone produces breast development. So here's a sort of normal sized breast, and then you'd be surprised in how large the breast can become during pregnancy. And that's because that's the point of the breast, is have the glands be able to produce milk in order to provide nutrient for the baby when it comes out. And then I find this to be really cool. Finally, the placenta also influences the increase of parathyroid hormone. If you remember, parathyroid hormone is a hormone that regulates calcium levels. And so this releases calcium from your bone where it's mainly stored. So it releases it from your bone bank, and it enters into your bloodstream so that the baby, your fetus, will be able to develop the skeleton. So I find that to be really cool. That's why it's very important to get a lot of good calcium in your body when you're young, because parathyroid hormone is going to start to drain that during pregnancy because it goes up. So I hope you enjoyed this first phase of pregnancy and a detailed look at fertilization. Thanks for watching.